Thank you everyone for joining my talk today. My name is Jila Agajari. I'm a PhD student in Computer Science Department at Lehigh University. In this talk, I'll be discussing our paper, What's the Norm Around Here, wherein we examine the mechanism by which norms around misinformation are perceived online. This work is motivated by the one that I and my co-author published in CSCW 2023. In that paper, we show that how lots of attention has been paid in addressing the individual impacts of misinformation. However, despite lots of various impacts that misinformation has at community level, less work has been done around understanding these impacts and addressing them. So in this work, we are focusing on one of these community level impacts, that is how misinformation influence perception about norms of a community. Lots of previous study has shown us how norms of a community influence people's behavior and the way that they respond to the behavior of others. Similarly, in the context of misinformation, they are a great community-oriented factor that influence people respond to misinformation. However, less is known about how norms in this context are perceived. Also, we are asking how norms around misinformation can then lead to broader perception about a community in terms of what a community as a whole tolerate, what types of behaviors they are likely to exhibit. So when referring to social norm, it's important to distinguish between two types of norms: collective norms that are referring to the actual norms in a community, and perceived norms that are related to people's perception of those norms. But these two can be really deviated from each other. For instance, consider the case of drinking. In a lot of previous studies, it's been shown that people often have exaggerated perception about how much others around them drink. And since they are influenced by perceived norms, in our study, we are also focusing on norm perception. And there are three types of norms perception. We have descriptive norms that are related to perception around how common a behavior is. We also have injunctive norms that refer to perception around whether a behavior is endorsed by others in a community. We also have subjective norms that refer to our perception around how we think we are expected to behave within a community. Now, there are insights from prior work around potential mechanisms that could be relevant to norm perception. For example, prevalence of behavior has been shown to influence people's behavior both in online and offline setting. For example, Mesroor et al. Shows that when people see a lot of other people show their personal pictures online, they are likely to do as well with higher intention. So in our case, we are examining whether that's the case in the context of misinformation. Another element that influences individuals' respond to various issues could be related to how others in a community respond to the same issue. For example, in a recent work, Colinder shows that when people see a piece of content, they look at others' responses to that piece of content when deciding whether or not the news is credible. And the author argues that it occurs through the impacting norm perception. But in that study, norms perception was not measured. So we are investigating that in our study. Another source of information that informs people about a community's norms could be related to communities' established roles. For example, in a recent work, Metis shows that providing normative information around communities' rules around harassing language can decrease instances of such conversation. But since, again, perception of norms were not measured, we don't know if that's the case and if that similarly is the case in the context of misinformation. So in our study, we are examining this. Now, norms are important not only by themselves, but through the broad impacts they have. One such impact could be influencing perception around social tolerance of various behavior. And these impressions are really important as they can really shape the way people decide to behave within a community. Also, motivated by how people who believe in one conspiracy theory are more likely to believe in other forms of conspiracy theory. In our study, we are asking whether that's the case related to perception or not. Specifically, we are asking, do norms related to one conspiracy theory guide expectation around belief in other forms of conspiracy theory or not? Also, motivated by how people often form exaggerated perception around norms of conspiracy theory, we are asking in this study, do such norms might form expectation around escalated behavior within a community? So to incorporate for this broader impression, we expanded our model. To test out this research question and hypothesize, we designed two complementary studies. In the first study, we used a screenshot method to get some primary results and to see whether our manipulation works. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip this study for this talk. We also designed a second study, which is a simulation-based study, and for that, we use a platform called Trueman. This platform is very similar to Facebook. However, researchers have all the control over the content and the interaction on this website. We ask participants to create an account on this platform and interact with the other users, which were bots, but they didn't know about it. So they could interact with this platform for a period of 1 day. It allows us to test out our manipulation in a more realistic setting and to measure norm perception in a more realistic setting. So for the 3 independent variables that I mentioned, we designed a 3x2x2 between subject study. We manipulated prevalence of behavior via controlling for the ratio of misinformation posts. And for that, we focused on anti-vaccine content. We also manipulated the type of community responses participants saw to be either pro-vaccine or anti-vaccine comments. And we also controlled for the community rules to be either present or absent depending on the experimental condition using a sticky note. So when we conducted our experiment and tested out our model, we learned that prevalence of misinformation as well as other responses to such content can greatly influence different types of norm perception. But we did not observe the effect of community rules on norm perception. We also observed the effect of this element on broader perception about a community. Also, we learned how norm perception guide this broader impression about a community, such as the likelihood of escalated behavior or belief in other forms of conspiracy theories. Now, these findings have important implications both for designing platforms for online communities as well as for designing policies for those communities. Since we learned the importance of community responses, it's important to foreground them when it comes to misinformation. So we can let people know that there are people in this community who disagree with this type of content. Also, it's important to note while community rules are important, they are probably not sufficient in addressing these broader impacts of misinformation on norm perception. Now, this study helped us understand what we noticed less explored in prior work. It helped us understand the impact of misinformation at the community level. This knowledge is important not only by itself, but by providing a very important trajectory for future work to examine. Thank you for listening to my talk, and please contact me with any question on our paper.